Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, is essentially a story about what it means to write, what it means to read, and how those two things might be connected. So this is the first short story that Argentinian author Jorge Luis Borges ever published under his own name in May of 1939. He has actually suffered a traumatic head injury back then, has been hallucinating a lot, and thought that he might not survive. A professor of mine once said that the genius of Borges lies in the fact that he has talked about every single problem that we can have in literature in one of his short stories. And isn't that an accomplishment? I couldn't agree more. I absolutely love the philosophical rabbit hole I get thrown down every time I pick up his short story collection. This is Fictions. I have it in the Penguin Modern Classics edition, and those short stories are so difficult to crack often, but I find it to be worth it over and over again. So I hope to illuminate the story a little bit today and make you aware of those problems of writing and reading in your own life. Before we get straight into the story, I'm super happy to say that this video is a collaboration of sorts with Nick over on the channel Read Red. We both love Borges, we have made videos about Borges before, and we have both recently read this very short story. So I'm gonna link his video as the first link in the description box. You can check it out after watching this one and see his take on it. And I just hope it shows you how inexhaustible great works of literature are, and that everyone sees something different in them. If you don't know his channel yet, I would really recommend checking it out. I think it's super cozy, down to earth, lovely videos. I enjoyed a lot, and can't wait to see what he has taken away from the story. So, on the first couple of pages of our short story, the narrator tells us about an author whose name is Pierre Menard. Our narrator seems to really admire Pierre Menard, and he tells us about all the works that Pierre Menard has written. They're all listed here. He has quite a large body of work, but more importantly, there are also a few books that he is still currently writing on. So the rest of the story focuses on those unfinished works. And I'll just read you this moment where the story switches from the finished works to the unfinished works. So it says, "I shall turn now to the other, the subterranean, the interminably heroic production, the œuvre non pareille, the œuvre that must remain, for such are our human limitations, unfinished. This work, perhaps the most significant writing of our time, consists in the 9th and 38th chapters of Part 1 of Don Quixote and a fragment of Chapter 22. I know that such a claim is on the face of it absurd, justifying that absurdity shall be the primary object of this note." So, what Pierre Menard is currently wanting to do is he wants to write Don Quixote. If you don't know, Don Quixote, I have it here, is a book that Cervantes published in 1604. One of the classics of world literature, often considered the first novel. I have an entire video about it if you are interested. But anyways, what Pierre Menard is trying to do apparently is to take some of these chapters of Don Quixote and write them. And now you might wonder, what does he mean? Does he mean just copying them or rewriting them? No, he means none of those things. So it says here, Pierre Menard did not want to compose another Quixote, which surely is easy enough. He wanted to compose the Quixote. Nor, surely, need one be obliged to note that his goal was never a mechanical transcription of the original. He had no intention of copying it. His admirable ambition was to produce a number of pages which coincided, word for word and line for line, with those of Miguel de Cervantes. So he didn't want to copy Cervantes, he wanted to become a person who would spontaneously reproduce this work, which is, if you think about it, genius. So he turns to learn Spanish, he reverts to Catholicism and tries to live his life as Miguel de Cervantes has lived it. And I don't know about you, but whenever I love an author, I also wonder about how this person lived. And I feel like there's this sort of belief in the air that if we could just live like the people whose works we admire, we would also spontaneously produce great art, you know. I think YouTube recommendations full of I tried Stephen King's writing routine, or I lived like Picasso for a week, you know, show us the current popularity of this approach. They're a testimony to our fascination with authors, with artists, and the fact that we think in a sort of deductive way that if we just copy their lifestyle, it will bring us closer to what they produced. Instead of seeing their lifestyle and their work as an expression of the same creative impulse inside of them. In short, we think that a certain lifestyle causes a certain creative output, instead of seeing both lifestyle and output as an expression of the same thing inside of a person. I really think that this concept of what an author is and how we perceive him is at the heart of this story of Borges. So just keep that in mind as we keep going. And we learn that Pierre Menard said, "My purpose is merely astonishing. The final term of a theological or metaphysical proof, the world around us, or God, or chance, or universal forms, is no more final, no more uncommon than my revealed novel." So he tries to find ways to spontaneously reproduce Don Quixote, or these 3 chapters of Don Quixote, which are all about writing, by the way, of course. And there's a beautiful line on page 38 where he says, "The task I have undertaken is not in essence difficult. If I could just be immortal, I could do it." So this idea that if just enough time would pass, you would at some point spontaneously produce, you know, these chapters of Don Quixote, really makes me think of the infinite monkey theorem. If you haven't heard of it, it's this idea that if you place a monkey in front of a typewriter and you just let him type whatever he wants, eventually he will produce everything that has ever been written, including the complete works of Shakespeare. Right? It's just a matter of time until that is the case, which is sort of the same idea here. He says, if I could just be immortal, I could do it, right? If I would have enough time, eventually I would run out of all other ideas and I would write these very chapters that I'm trying to write. If you're a fan of Alan Watts, a very key idea in his teachings is that if you would have the freedom to choose any life you want over and over again and live them all, eventually you would end up living the life that you're living right now. So Pierre Menard says that his problem is, without the shadow of a doubt, much more difficult than Cervantes's, right? Producing something for the first time is much, much easier because it comes spontaneously than it is to try and reproduce it. So let's get a little bit more into this idea of authorship now and what it means to write. Because the truth is, we all have in our minds some idea of what it means to be an author, and we unknowingly project a lot of our imagination onto writers, I think especially writers we love. We put them on a pedestal in some way. And I was really astonished when I learned about authorship concepts in university last year for the first time, because I realized that the way we view writers historically has changed a lot, and that in a way we're just caught in a web of imaginations that we project onto whoever's name is on the cover of a book. Let me explain that a little bit more. There are in essence 4 different ways you could view authors, and I'm curious to hear what you think an author is. So the first way of viewing authorship is that you could say the text is way more important than the author. For example, historically in fairy tales, that was the case. You know, when you tell the fairy tale of Snow White, you're usually not too concerned with who came up with it. That's not a big part of the story. And that was the case before ownership was a real concept. You know, also in the oral traditions, stories were just handed down. Of course, people still today think that a text is a text and it shouldn't matter who wrote it. You know, and in a way, I think that too. The next concept is to see the author as a seer or a channeler for some higher wisdom. So this means that you think that authors are subjects to godly inspiration, that they're merely a channel where information or creativity flows through. They're either kissed by a muse or visions strike them. And that might sound maybe almost religious, but it's the same with people who write under the influence of drugs, right? The idea is that the personal will is shut off, sort of your personality and your person and your will go to the side, and you let the subconscious speak, you let something come through you. Like when Nabokov says, speak memory, or Milton calls on the muse, you know, sing heavenly muse. And again, with this concept, I kind of believe that that's true as well. But you could also see authors entirely differently in the third way, where you could just say an author is a scholar and the art of writing can be learned. You know, writing follows certain rules. It's all about dedication. It's like learning a craft. Anyone can learn it. It just depends on the time you put into it. And that it is a normal job in a structured society like any other. Or, and this is the last concept, you could see the author as a genius, as a person who draws inspiration not from the outside, not through some channel, but from the inside. That there is something innately different about creative people, about great authors. That an author is a standalone with a rich inner world that is not influenced by the outside. They're gifted in a way, right? So you're either born an author or you're not. And there's a huge fixation on the person, you know, those people create almost a cult around them. Like Lord Byron, he's always the poster child of this authorship concept of genius. And I must say, I also find it difficult to not see Byron as a genius. If I read some of those lines, I'm like, there must be something innately different about you. And we even say, you know, it's genius. Anyways, that just goes to show the different pictures that we have of authors in our society. And if you're anything like me, you feel yourself kind of being tugged between those views on any given day, and how I project different authorship concepts onto different authors that I read. So, you know, maybe pay attention to that next time you pick up your favorite book or your favorite author, what kind of image you have of them writing, what it means to you that they're writing. So in the actual Don Quixote, Cervantes also compares being a writer with being a soldier. So this is one of the chapters that Pierre Menard tries to reproduce. I recommend you check them out, but I'll just read you this little quote here. I think it's very telling. And it is a proven truth that what costs most is and should be most valued. To become eminent in letters costs time, sleepless nights, hunger, nakedness, dizzy spells, indigestion, and other related problems, some of which I have already mentioned. But to go through the various stages necessary to become a good soldier costs everything that it costs to be a student to such a greater degree that there is no comparison between the two, because at every step one is on the point of losing one's life. So back to the text, there are a couple of really beautiful quotes on page 40. One is that ambiguity is richness. And the other is that Pierre Menard has apparently divine modesty because he has an ironic habit of putting forth ideas that were the exact opposite of those he actually held. I just find those absolutely beautiful thoughts and human traits. So anyways, he finally reproduces part of a sentence of the Quixote and he compares them to the original. So here is what Pierre Menard has written. Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and the future's counselor. That's what Pierre Menard has written. Now here is what is in the original Don Quixote. Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and the future's counselor. So putting aside the beauty of those two sentences for a moment, it's interesting to see, if you paid attention, that those are the exact same sentences. Or are they? I mean, I think Borges is making fun of us here a little bit, because having them so obviously side by side, it's very easy to see that it's literally the same word in the same print twice. But if we don't laugh that off so quickly and glaze over it, we can actually examine our habit of interpreting text a little bit. Because if you're given a text that is written by Miguel de Cervantes, you might read it very differently than a text that is written by Pierre Menard, an author you've never heard of and maybe don't care too much about. So it might in essence as well be that your act of reading and interpreting the text is actually changing how good you think it is, how memorable you think it is, even though you've read the same thing twice. And that is, I think, really what Borges is trying to point out to us here in this story, is that being a reader is not a passive act. You're not getting handed something on a silver platter. No, you're bringing with you your anticipations for what you think this text might or might not bring you. And that what you're projecting onto an author is part of the reading experience. And I think Borges really makes fun of us here. He says, the contrast in styles is equally striking, right? And he says that Menard's style is very archaic, whereas Cervantes' style in the Old Spanish is completely natural, right? Even though we're reading the same text twice. And then the next line, there is no intellectual exercise that is not ultimately pointless. Anyways, if we turn to the last 2 pages, we read, I have reflected that it is legitimate to see the final Quixote as a kind of palimpsest. I've talked about palimpsest before here on this channel. It's the idea of intertextuality, basically meaning that whatever you write is built on top of all the texts that came before you, and that you can see them shining through the paper. what is that again? Like some old printing or writing style where you always see what has been there before as a constant building on top of one another. And especially in postmodernism, so especially the past, 100 years or so, this idea has gotten really prevalent that it's not possible anymore to create anything original. You just have to place yourself somewhere in the web of text. I think Thomas Bernhard said in Gehen that, or walking in English, that everything that is said is quoted, right? And you could say that this is somewhat depressing, that we're living in a perpetual echo chamber of ideas. That's a little bit how my professor put it in a class recently. But I don't find it depressing, not when I read Borges. Like, he has a way of talking about these subjects that is just genius. Like, when you get to the bottom of these problems that Borges is talking about in his stories, it's lucid, it's freeing in a way, and it's challenging us to abandon our rigid mindset of a linear progression of events, of cold hard science, to the point where he's cracking, I think, the shells of our egos, where we just have to look around and see that the concepts around us are not fixed, whether that's authorship, whether it's someone has written a text and that's how it is, or whether it's language or time or any of these things. I think there is like a reality beyond the obvious scientific worldview that we have. And I think that Borges was very aware of that, and that his short stories are the ideal pointers to go beyond that. But that's the key, like, not in a depressing way. I'm not the biggest fan of postmodern literature, because often this topic of, everything is just, we're just living in text, and everything has already been said, and you can't do anything original anymore. Like, that is talked about in a dead end kind of way. But with Borges, I just never find that to be the case. And also, like, one of the last quotes I have marked here perfectly shows that, in my opinion. He says, "Thinking, meditating, imagining," he also wrote me, "are not anomalous acts. They are the normal respiration of the intelligence. Every man should be capable of all ideas, and I believe that in the future he shall be." And just as some last notes, I think it's interesting to know that Borges has often published his own stories under someone else's name. Susan Sontag, I think, said that postmodern art is an instrument for modifying consciousness, right? So we have to read these texts and allow them to change us. How beautiful is that? I think that perfectly sums up the purpose of literature. So if you're willing to share, please tell me what comes up for you when you're hearing these ideas. I would love to read from you. Check out Nick's video, and otherwise I'll see you again very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.